Before I start, I know Possible Street just made this video on the exact same scenario. I am using his maps, so big shout out to him. The script has been just about finished for 2 months and is different from his. And with that, let's get into the scenario. In 1864, the Second Schleswig War ended. In this war, Prussia and the Austrian Empire divided Denmark's German lands between them. After this, in 1866, the Austro-Prussian War started. This is because of a dispute between Prussia and the Austrian Empire over the administration of Schleswig-Holstein. The Austro-Prussian War was a war between the Austrian Empire, Prussia, and Italy. In this war, Prussia invaded Austria. This was with the help of Italy. Historically, in this war, the Austrians had to split their forces and fared well on the Italian front but lost on the German front. This led to Austria losing Venetia to the Italians and being isolated from German affairs. The loss of this war also led to the Hungarians gaining great influence in the empire, with Austria-Hungary being created. What if this changed? The change is rather simple, with Austria historically about to give Venetia to the Italians willingly. So all we need to change is the Austrians swallowing their pride and ceding Venetia to the Italians before they signed Bismarck's alliance. With this change made, the Austrians can now use all their resources on the German front. In this war, the Austrians would also have most minor German states, including the biggest, Bavaria, Hanover, Saxony, Württemberg, and Baden on their side. In this war, we are also going to have the Austrian High Command express more initiative. If they had historically, they could have fared a lot better. Now with these changes, the Austrians would join together with their smaller German allies, quickly occupy the Rhineland, and then win battles while slowly pushing into Prussia. In the peace, the Austrians would take Silesia and give France compensation for being neutral in the form of a buffer state along the Rhine. The Austrians would also restructure the German Confederation. This would be allowed to happen because of no powerful Prussia to stop it. This would be nothing like Prussia had done with their aggressive nation building. This would be a somewhat loose confederation in which the Austrian Empire could exercise more control. The consequences of this would be immense. This would be because of a massive superpower in the middle of Europe with a population of 70 million. This being said, it wouldn't be fully centralized, but to put that in perspective, that would be more than Britain and France combined, although it would be lower than Russia's 80 million. This state would likely be quickly industrializing, even eclipsing Britain. There would also likely be further integration of the German states into Austria, while the non-German lands would be Germanized, possibly even treated like colonies. This would be similar to how Germany in our timeline treated the Polish lands they controlled. This new empire would also likely focus on the Balkans, like the Austrians had historically. Side effects: Napoleon III would never be overthrown, and praised further having secured a buffer for France and Italian lands. This would mean France would reign an empire, and his throne would likely go down to Napoleon IV and keep the Bonaparte dynasty alive. In the scramble for Africa, the French, British, and Italians would likely get more, with the Austrians not being too focused on Africa, but they may potentially get something if there was enough public support and they built their navy up enough. If this were to happen, they may go for Madagascar or Somalia. I find it more likely they don't get anything though. At this point, I'm going to go into 2 different scenarios. In the Balkans, the Austrians would have ambitions. These would likely overlap with the Russians. In 1877, the Russian invasion of the Ottomans would be followed up with the Austrians backing the Turks to prevent Russian hegemony over the Balkans. The French would likely join on the Turks' side after the Austrians to gain more influence in the Middle East in the declining empire. This war would be similar to the Crimean War, but much more decisive. In this war, the Russians would be stopped because of the large modern Austrian army. In the peace, the Russians would have to give borderlands and parts of Crimea to the Ottomans. This would dash Russian power projection in the Black Sea, as well as just generally humiliating them. This may lead to a similar result of the Crimean War, where the Russians would be woken up and focus further on modernization. This war would also re-establish Ottoman power in the Middle East and Balkans. Along with this, historically in this war, the French seized Tunisia from the Ottomans. This would not happen in this scenario. This re-cemented Ottoman power may also prevent a British seizure of Egypt. If this were to happen, there's a good chance the British would try to heavily influence the Ottomans. During the war, the Ottomans would have to take out loans to finance the war. This would be from Austrian and French banks. This would mean that the Austrians and French would gain a lot of power in the Ottomans and their financial policy. This would heavily anger the British, who historically shared this role with the French. It would also reduce British influence in the Ottomans. This would mean the Ottomans would further align with the French and Austrians. This may only be for a short amount of time, because without a British Egypt, it is much more important for the British that the Ottomans stay strong, so the Suez stays secure and open. This French and Austrian cooperation could lead to great Franco-Austrian relations and possibly an alliance. This would lead to them being in an economic/military bloc. The British, Russians, and Italians would be in their own alliance to counter this friendship. This would lead to a very interesting balance of power. If it were to happen in about 1900, the Austrians and French would be outnumbered nearly 200 million to about 140 million, and would be slightly edged out in terms of economics. Overall, it would be relatively equal. I can't really predict where this would go because of how different it is from our timeline. On to scenario 2. When the Russians would invade the Ottomans in 1877, it would be followed up with the Austrians invading the Ottomans. This would lead to the Austrians and Russians partitioning the Balkans. This would cause the British to invade and fear that the Ottomans would collapse. They would get most of the Middle East. After this invasion, the British would compensate the French and Italians, the French with Tunisia, and the Italians with Libya. This would lead to them being in their own alliance and the Austrians and Russians being in their own bloc. Like the Franco-Austrian alliance, this would lead to a very interesting balance of power. If it were to happen around 1900, the British alliance would be relatively equal in terms of economics, but they would be outnumbered nearly 200 million to 110 million. From here, I can't really predict where this would go because of how different it is from our timeline. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, you could leave a comment to help me against the algorithm.